Crises in the Middle East and Ukraine have crowded Taiwan out of international news coverage recently, but a fight over Taiwan could have catastrophic effects, triggering the worst global crisis since World War II. U.S. officials have been warning that China could try to take control of Taiwan within the next few years. The question is how they might try to do so. There are 5 possible strategies the Chinese government could take to finally achieve control of Taiwan. What's changed is that China is rapidly building up the military capabilities necessary to carry out an assault on Taiwan, at the same time that the island's politics are trending farther and farther away from Beijing. We could spend hours talking about the history of this dispute, but here are a few key things you need to know. China considers Taiwan a renegade province which must be reunified sooner or later. This dispute dates back to the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. The U.S. became more involved in 1950 when the U.S. Navy protected Taiwan during the Korean War. During the 1950s, Mao Zedong's forces shelled 2 of Taiwan's islands, Kinmen and Matsu, triggering crisis with the United States. This isn't a simple invade or don't invade binary. China's possible strategies range from what's already happening today, systematic coercion short of war, to a full-on invasion. First is Xi's preferred approach. Xi would surely love to win without fighting. The Chinese military has already been ramping up military coercion, like flying into Taiwan's air defense identification zone and barreling across the center line of the Taiwan Strait. Disinformation, cyber attacks, and efforts to isolate Taiwan diplomatically round out this campaign. This strategy is designed to exhaust Taiwan's army, reduce its physical space, and create a sense that the island is unable to defend itself. The trouble is, this strategy isn't working. Over the past decade, Chinese pressure has undermined the relatively Beijing-friendly KMT party and empowered the more hawkish, independence-minded DPP. Support for unification among the Taiwanese populace is vanishingly small, especially since Xi's ruthless crackdown in Hong Kong in 2019. At the same time, a distinctive sense of Taiwanese identity is growing stronger, not just among DPP voters, but among the population as a whole. If Xi hopes to peel international support away from Taiwan, his tactics are doing the reverse. The U.S. is increasing arms sales, expanding high-level visits, and otherwise doubling down on its relationship with Taipei. Taiwan is about to have its next presidential election in January 2024. If DPP candidate Lai Ching-te wins the 2024 elections, and he delivers the party its 3rd straight presidential term, Xi Jinping would have to ask whether coercion without war has failed. That brings us to the second possible strategy. Sooner or later, Xi might consider more escalatory options, like seizing one of Taiwan's offshore islands. After all, some of those islands probably aren't defensible if the People's Liberation Army attacks. It would force Taiwan to decide between committing and probably losing much of its military in a futile effort to defend the islands, and watching as a slice of its territory is swallowed by Beijing. But such obvious territorial aggression could backfire. It might turbocharge Taiwan's sluggish defense reforms, catalyze the formation of a more formal anti-China alliance in the region, or lead Washington to issue clearer commitments to defend Taiwan's remaining islands. It could turn out to be a small step that makes every subsequent step harder to take. A third option would be the blockade. In this scenario, Xi would seize upon some pretext to cut Taiwan off from the outside world. A blockade could involve anything from a full-bore physical quarantine, enforced by warships and military aircraft, to aggressive customs inspections of ships trying to access Taiwan, combined with missile tests that scare off maritime traffic outside Taiwan's ports. It could include cyber attacks on financial institutions or other economic infrastructure as well. Unlike an island seizure, the blockade wouldn't necessarily require China to fire the first shot, at least in theory, but it could make life very precarious for Taiwan, which depends on imported food, fuel, and other essentials, and perhaps compel its people to accept unification as the price of survival. Historically, blockades have rarely caused countries to surrender, unless they're combined with other sharp pressures. Even in the best-case scenario, a blockade would take time to work, which would give Washington and other countries time to organize a response. The U.S. would probably orchestrate relief flights and naval convoys, while also flooding the Western Pacific with its attack submarines, and otherwise positioning its forces exactly as it would want them arrayed if war broke out, effectively daring Beijing to intervene. If a blockade doesn't work, China might choose a fourth option, bombardment. Blasting Taiwan with bombs and ballistic missiles could help intensify the effects of a blockade by destroying road networks that connect Taiwan's most accessible ports to its most important cities. This campaign would wreck Taiwan's Air Force and Navy. At its most ambitious, a bombardment campaign would try to coerce unification by breaking the will of the population, a modern-day equivalent of Germany's Blitz during World War II. A bombardment campaign would feature some of China's most formidable advantages, such as the world's largest ground-based missile force. So long as Beijing didn't begin this campaign by also hitting US bases in the Western Pacific, it would force Washington to decide whether to intervene on behalf of a friend that might not hold out. But this approach isn't guaranteed to work either. Even if a bombing campaign destroys many targets, there's no guarantee that military punishment will achieve the political objective she seeks, convincing the government and populace of Taiwan to surrender to Beijing. And if any bombardment campaign doesn't succeed quickly, its risks dramatically increase. The longer Beijing is pounding Taiwan and killing its people, the more international outrage it will generate. The fifth and final option is the nightmare scenario. A full-scale invasion would likely begin with a massive air and missile strike against Taiwan's armed forces and critical infrastructure, coupled with sabotage and attempts to assassinate its leadership. The PLA would then try to seize beaches, ports, and airfields, using them to ferry in the troops and supplies necessary to conquer the island. Xi's navy would seek to isolate Taiwan from foreign interference or support. Along the way, China might hammer US forces with surprise missile attacks on American bases in Guam and Japan, or on aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific. Or perhaps it would try to use the threat of nuclear escalation to deter Washington from even getting involved. The attraction of this approach is its directness. There would be no waiting for a blockade to slowly squeeze the life out of Taiwan's economy. China would exploit speed, brutality, and surprise to resolve the Taiwan question before anyone could get in the way. It's a mistake to think that Xi would never try something so shocking. China has a long tradition of starting its wars with surprise attacks, as US forces discovered in Korea in 1950 and the Vietnamese learned in 1979. China would also have to make a world-shaking choice on day one of any invasion attempt, whether or not to attack US bases and military forces in the region. If Beijing doesn't do so, its ships and troops will be sitting ducks for US air power and sea power if Washington does decide to get directly involved. But if China does attack US forces, killing hundreds, perhaps thousands of Americans, it has started a war with a vengeful superpower. To be clear, there's no evidence Xi has decided to escalate the confrontation with Taiwan, even though he clearly wants the ability to do so. So if Taiwan, the United States, and their friends can keep the price of aggression high, while also reassuring Beijing that inaction won't simply result in Taiwanese independence, which no Chinese government can accept, perhaps Xi will decide that tolerating an awkward status quo is less costly than changing it, or perhaps not. Xi may not be willing to live indefinitely with a status quo he probably considers unjust, even insulting, to a China that he feels is reclaiming its proper place atop Asia and the world. He doesn't seem to understand how his own actions have undermined the status quo. A decision to fight could have awful consequences for China and the world, but history is littered with wars that those who started them came to regret. The US and its friends need to be ready for all the courses of action Xi might pursue, especially the one whose effects would be most catastrophic.